University of Southampton.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, for that introduction. Yeah, I'll get right into it. I have sort of a whole lot of pictures, and then there's a period where you just get stuck on one picture for a while. And I'm going to try not to read too much, but in the middle I might read a little bit. But this comes out of, it's a kind of, I'm interested generally in genre, romantic comedy genre. I've written about that, Bridget Jones and Devil Wears Prada, things like that. But I'm also interested in women filmmakers, and I've been interested more recently in this, in thinking about independent women filmmakers and women of color, the kinds of films that they end up being able to make. So I'm going to start, and a large chunk is going to be about American independent women filmmakers, Black American independent women filmmakers, and then I'm going to talk about the research that's going on at the UK, since it's still somewhat in the early days. It's sort of just gestural stuff. But I just wanted to put this in the context, talking about the American stuff, in the context of the research that's done on women who work in the film industry. The annual celluloid ceiling report that comes out of San Diego State University has been going since 1998, and they take the top 300 grossing films each year in the domestic audiences of America. So it's got its limitations. And they count all the numbers of women in these roles: directors, writers, producers, editors, and cinematographers. And one of always my favorite graph is this one that starts that includes 1998 and goes up and gives you a couple different years up to 2004. Because what you see is essentially nothing changes. There is no improving picture for women in filmmaking in at least the top money makers whatsoever. In any of these areas, directors, 9% in 1998 to 7% in 2014. So in some instances, they're kind of getting worse. And one of the things that my project does is parallels this research in the UK context to think about how we might find filmmakers, more women filmmakers in the independent arenas and outside of Hollywood, which is one of the things that actually they do as well. They look at American independent film and have shown that you do get more women filmmakers, though still not very much. I think directors go from 9% to maybe 17%. But in that context of the low numbers of women filmmakers, it's getting lots of more media attention these days. The other thing that gets some media attention is the role of women audiences, women genres, and some high-profile women filmmakers across different genres. But the one I'm interested in today, of course, is rom-coms and chick flicks. So this summer, with the kind of standout success of Amy Schumer's Trainwreck, which she wrote, I've been thinking about, along with Diane Negra, romantic comedies. Which I'm just going to touch on briefly, in part because there are some famous women like Nancy Meyers and Nora Ephron who've become well known for starting off as writers and becoming directors of rom-coms. And then the writers of these, Kristen Wiig of Bridesmaids and Amy Schumer of Trainwreck, have made it the rom-com sort of, have quite standout, financially successful rom-coms. Though actually, this film and this film, which both came out this summer, have made the same amount of money, but everyone's talking about Trainwreck rather than The Intern. And you can ask me about that later, why I think that is later. So Frank Krutnick has observed, to succeed, romantic comedies must do more than simply redress themselves in contemporary fashions. They must engage with the shifting priorities and possibilities of intimate culture and with the broader cultural, social, and economic spheres that organize its meanings. So in another piece I am working on with Diane Negra, we're considering how the romantic comedy in the contemporary period, even just the last 5 years, appears to have become moribund, or at least dormant, for the present moment after its post-feminist heights of the early 2000s with Legally Blonde, Bridget Jones, and a whole slew of Anne Heigl films. What's her name? Sorry, not Anne, yes. Sorry, I just forgot her name. But anyway, you know all those films I'm talking about, like 27 Bridesmaids Dresses, that kind of thing. But we're thinking about how, despite the massive success of Trainwreck, the film itself actually forgoes dealing with those broader issues. It doesn't update much, really. In some ways, my first thought after I saw it was it's like Bridget Jones in America on speed. Like, she's just the same kinds of klutzy, over-the-top, sexually liberated woman who still, in the end, searches for kind of conservative romantic conclusion. So one of the things I'm interested today in exploring independent films rather than studio rom-coms is the way that they may or may not engage more explicitly with those broader social and economic spheres. And particularly around the films that I'm interested in by ethnic minority filmmakers, in part because, of course, one of the main criticisms levied regularly at rom-coms and chick flicks is how, besides their apparent retrogressive gender politics, is how utterly white they are. Notwithstanding Will Smith's Hitch, in which his romantic love interest is Eva Mendes, there are very few studio rom-coms about non-white characters. But there are plenty of Black American romantic comedies. It's just that they are largely made by independent studios and marketed to Black audiences as niche audiences. There's only 2 here that were made by studios, and you can probably guess which ones. In part, I've put them together, but because they have the most well-known stars in them there, Eddie Murphy and Angela Bassett. However, all these films made a profit, some more than others, and in fact, neither of those studio picks did particularly well based on their budgets, though they did make profits. Think Like a Man was the 34th highest grossing film of 2012, making $92 million. And Diary of a Mad Black Woman, which was written by Tyler Perry but not directed by him, and now he directs everything he writes, made $50 million off a $5 million budget. And just for some context about blockbusters and what makes money and what doesn't, The Expendables 2 made $6 million less than Think Like a Man. So Schwarzenegger couldn't quite beat out that romantic comedy. So just to think, again, a little bit more context before I get into some specific films, there have been only 3 Hollywood studio films ever directed by Black women. And in 2014, to start with the most recent past, in 2014, Ava DuVernay became the first Black woman director to be nominated for the Golden Globes Best Director Award. It's an important first, and it was quickly followed by the Academy Awards Best Picture nomination for her film, Selma, the first film by a Black woman to be directed in that category. Widespread critical praise for the film and its star, David Oyelowo, who plays Martin Luther King, increased the public profile of both DuVernay and Oyelowo. However, controversy swirled around the conspicuous lack of nominations after that first Golden Globe nomination for DuVernay's directing. There was no Academy Award nomination, no Directors Guild nomination, nothing by the BAFTAs for her or for Oyelowo. And there's some debate about whether the studio messed up by not putting out early screeners, but that's kind of actually sort of still up for debate. And the one thing it did do, which I'm interested in, is it gave rise to many opinion pieces about the representation of Black Americans in film, the lack of diversity amongst members of various awarding bodies, and it was noted that all those awarding bodies are largely white men over the age of 60, and the low numbers of women directing feature films in Hollywood, and then most importantly, the even lower numbers and more rare occurrence of Black women directing Hollywood films or feature-length films at all. But DuVernay, as you can see here, is not the first Black woman to direct a Hollywood feature film. She's the third. The first was French filmmaker Usain Palcy. He directed the adaptation of A Dry White Season with Marlon Brando. And the second was Darnell Martin, who wrote and directed I Like It Like That. It is also a kind of family romantic comedy. But the 20 years between these two here is, of course, something that surely should be read as Hollywood's systematic discrimination against women, Black women, and Black stories in general, I would think. So compared to Hollywood, the independent film scene in America has been more productive, if not always welcoming, but place for Black women filmmakers. So this arena has allowed, and began with shorts, documentaries, features, and the significance of those have been well articulated by other critics like Jacqueline Bobo and Gloria Gibson, who show that Black women's filmmaking in America does actually have quite a long history and is not just a contemporary history. So during the 1990s evolution of American independent studio, with major studios entering into that sector, Hollywood studios at the very least having distribution arms geared towards independent cinema or international cinema. 3 independent feature films were made by African American women and achieved varying levels of critical or box office success. So you have Julie Dash's Daughter of the Dust, which was the first feature full-length film by an African American woman and was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and has become a staple on kind of feminist or Black American cinema syllabi. And then you have Leslie Harris's Just Another Girl on the IRT, which won special jury prize at the Sundance Film Festival. And Cassie Lemon's debut feature film Eve's Bayou, which was the highest grossing independent American film of 1997. And has massive widespread critical adoration. So the first two films in particular appear during a period that Paula Massoud describes as Black City cinema, that rise in Black filmmakers and films like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, Set It Off. And their films also appeared, but all of these films also appeared at a time, particularly in the early 90s, when, as Christina Lane puts it, women filmmakers like Nancy Savoca and Alison Anders were on the verge of an indie explosion. And one of the things that happens both in Hollywood and independent cinema with women filmmakers is there's this perennial sense of, oh, look, Amy Schumer, oh, look, Kristen Wiig, oh, look, Cassie Lemons, oh, look, Catherine Bigelow, this is going to be it, things are going to finally change. And as my earlier slide showed, it never does. But back to thinking about Black cinema as the context, though the early 90s was seen as a kind of renaissance of Black cinema in America, the numbers of Black women are actually very low. Of that year in 1991, there were 15 feature films by Black American directors. Julie Dash is the only woman. So Jacqueline Bobo argues in her 1998 chapter, Black Women's Films, Genesis of a Tradition, which I referred to earlier, that centering Black women as subjects, recognizable as human beings, is paramount in Black women's films. And in her article, Black Women's Independent Cinema, Gloria Gibson considers some films from the 90s and shows that films by Black women provide narratives that relate to historical occurrences and conditions, beliefs and values that are germane to Black women. Consequently, their cinematic frames challenge decades of structural silence levied against African American women. So thinking about that long history of Black women being left out of filmmaking as a structural silence is important. And the context for thinking about these understudied films, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So Carmen Kustat, in her chapter, Love on My Mind, Creating Black Women's Love Stories, she also argues that for Black women filmmakers, their sheer existence challenges that structural silence. So Kustat tells this really interesting story about a time when she was on a panel of all Black women filmmakers at a kind of filmmaking academic mixed conference. And a white woman in the crowd critiqued one of the documentaries by one of the Black women for not challenging the form at all, for not having any kind of aesthetic challenge to the history, the sort of standard documentary. So Kustat says in her piece, I very clearly stated that my colleague had challenged every form of filmmaking because she was a Black woman standing behind the camera, and she put Black women in front of it. That combination alone defied every form. So as Kustat implies with her retort to this woman, the white woman's critique is informed by her own racial privilege in the ways that it disregards the marginalization of Black women throughout cinema history, and the fact that Black women's films about Black women, no matter the form, can be understood as both political and aesthetic challenges to that history by simply reinserting Black American women into cinema history. The white woman's emphasis on form may also have been a product of the historical times, which she's writing about is the kind of late 70s, in which feminist film studies privileged the avant-garde text and its ability to, quote, destroy the satisfaction, pleasure, and privilege of the masculine gaze, as of course Laura Mulvey argued in her seminal article on visual pleasure and narrative cinema. And of course, other critics, like Bell Hooks, have argued that the avant-garde does have the ability to challenge the dominant whiteness and patriarchy of cinema. And Hooks herself says, if we long to transform the culture, then we have to embrace the avant-garde and experimental, so that intrinsic belief, intrinsic value for the avant-garde to challenge, to be the most politically challenging kind of cinema. At the same time as Hooks says that, though, she has quite a lot of affirmation for Julie Dash's short film called Illusions, which is a short film she made before Daughters of the Dust. And in that film, it's a story of an African-American woman who's able to pass as white. And because she's able to do so, she gets a big producing job in a Hollywood studio. And is able to bring forward stories, and tries to bring forward stories about like the Navajo American Indians who use their language to speak in code and to avoid the Nazi translators, but anyone in the studio is not really having it. And there's this kind of interesting interaction between her and a young Black singer who's called in to re-sing over a film that has been badly dubbed because the white female star has all the star quality except for their ability to sing. So it's a great short film, and it does exactly what all these critics are talking about, which is reinserting black women into the history of Hollywood cinema and kind of hidden and marginalized spaces that they've been and bringing them forward. But Hooks likes the film, but she's she's slightly wary of it. She says it offers the black female spectator representations that challenge stereotypical notions that place us outside the realm of filmic discursive practices. But she's also worried that it could, because it is narratively mainstream and not avant-garde, she worries that it could be easily co-opted into a kind of dominant hegemonic history. So, taking all these thoughts together, the complex mix of socio-cultural historical factors that include racism, sexism, the historical domination of Hollywood cinema, the politics of form, of course, both popular and alternative, and the cultural politics of black women's authorship can, of course, not be easily teased apart, nor should they be. So today, I'm focusing my the next little section on the independent romantic comedies of Sana Hamri, as well as some gestures towards the end of Gina Prince Bythewood's films. And they do, though, raise all these issues that I've been talking about, in large part because they are films by black women about black women. And they largely draw, and even as they largely draw on mainstream aesthetic forms, they follow the romantic comedy convention plot fairly closely, and even pick up on some of its tropes in the kind of mainstream areas. Both of them still consequently have political problematic elements, but also reinsert that black women stories and black women filmmakers into that history. So as a feminist film scholar, I hold the view that as the numbers of women directing films remain so low, and is clearly a product of a sexist industry and culture, the study of women's film authorship is inherently political, even if the films are not necessarily obviously progressive. And as a white woman, I recognize that this is doubly true for the study of black women filmmakers whose films are regularly left out of both women's film studies and film history more generally. And Hamri's films have largely been overlooked in studies of both contemporary black cinema and contemporary women's cinema. There's hardly anything, if anything at all, written about them. Okay, so this is where I'm going to stick on this one slide for a little bit. So thinking about Hamri's position in the independent sphere, I'm going to stick on this one slide. Hamri's films, the two films called Something New and Just Right, are independent by virtue of their production, and distribution, and industrial context. So Homegrown Pictures, along with Mini Major Gramercy, produced Something New, and Focus Features, the art house division of NBC Universal, distributed. I'll just go back here if you're wondering. So these two films here. Just Right was produced by Flavor Unit Entertainment with Fox Searchlight Pictures, who also distributed the film. So these are all independent producing or distribution, or at least mini majors, because of course we're in that period when the majors have moved into independent filmmaking because they realized they could make money in that area, of course. Both are aesthetically mainstream, utterly. There's nothing avant-garde about them. There's nothing even kind of quirky independent about them, which makes it harder in some ways to suggest, because of that tradition in feminist film studies, in particular for this context of thinking of the political as directly linked to the avant-garde, it makes it a bit harder to claim that her films question the resistance and raise questions of resistance and social oppression, or that they stem from black feminism, as Gibson has argued that other previous black women filmmakers' films do. However, they do center black women as the subjects, and consequently they challenge that structural and silence imposed on black women. And I want to suggest that in some ways they do offer alternative representations of black women that they productively engage with, and challenge to some sense the usual stereotypes, even in the midst of that narrative mainstream convention. And one thing I hope to show when I look at the two films a little bit closely is that it's possible to see both of them as inverting Martin Patrick's claim that Hollywood's usurpation of new strategies in independent film continues to halt the progress of African-American cinema, in part because of the ways that they contribute to the development of African-American cinema by co-opting Hollywood conventions into the independent realm. So instead of not to take back any kind of critiques of Hollywood for stealing from Black and independent American cinema, which it does, but kind of trying to see a mirrored version of that in the ways that she draws on Hollywood cinema in her kind of independent arena. So one of the key ways that Hammer's Something New and Just Right both use and disrupt Hollywood cinema is, of course, through their romantic plots. In Something New, Kenya McQueen is an uptight accountant who falls for Brian, her white landscape gardener, of whom Kenya's upper-middle-class family disapprove. In Just Right, Queen Latifah plays Leslie Wright, who's a physical therapist who falls for the pro basketball player Scott McKnight, played by Common, who she treats. So as Donald Bogle has shown, American cinema has an ongoing inability to portray Black women as anything other than mammies, Jezebels, tragic mulattoes, and angry Black women. Sorry, this is where I want to be. And as Kustat says, which is that other quote here, stories about love can be constructive political projects. There are few films from Black women's perspectives about romance. Where she says, images of romantic love tend to reduce Black women to sex objects and male adornments, but I'm always wanting to know who she is. So the politics of Hammer's films that I consider here are simple but clear. They are by Black women and are about Black women and love. Furthermore, as I will show a little bit, as romance films, they also challenge the conventions of what Michelle Schreiber calls the post-feminist romance film that encompasses a range of genres, from romantic dramas to art films. So one of the things that Schreiber articulates is that as the key tenet of post-feminist romance films is choice. And this is a common feminist criticism of contemporary post-feminist cinema, is the idea that somehow women have to choose between career, always in romantic comedies and chick flicks, women have to choose between career and love, and usually they choose love. So she says the symbiotic relationship between post-feminist discourses and romance results in these popular films' mediation of the illusory notion that contemporary women's lives can be reduced to either or options. The most significant of these is the age-old choice between career versus love and family, but also includes other dilemmas between sexual expression, self-absorption, community investment, and others. So one of the things I'm going to get to at the end is that though her films do structure their plots around these choices, they're a bit different than the mainstream post-feminist romances about white women. That question of choice ends differently on the whole. So just to reiterate that, what I'm suggesting is that the romance plots of these films are their sites of resistance. In part, that's the way they cast Black women and the way they use the marriage plot. So the traditional stereotypes of Black women, the Jezebel, the Sapphire, the Mammy, exist, I would suggest, as one way to think about it is they exist as binaries, the kind of cult of true womanhood, of white womanhood, which idealizes women as pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, and therefore deserving of marriage. So despite the long history of diverse and complex scholarship on 19th century novels like Jane Eyre and the novels of Jane Austen, for contemporary popular culture, Jane Austen's novels, Jane Eyre, the other kind of 19th century novels about women continue to epitomize a kind of idealistic version of the romance plot as a Bildungsroman for women. This continues throughout the myriad film, television adaptations of the novels, as well as the way they are used as templates and sources for contemporary post-feminist romance novels and films, such as Bridget Jones's Diary and the Twilight Saga, which she said was partly based around Wuthering Heights. And the plot of young white women who discover their worth through the process of finding and or choosing the right man. So the Jezebel's wanton sexuality, the Sapphire's angry dominance over Black men, and the Mammy's loyalty to her white slaves, which is grounded in her sexless identity and superstitious identity, all function to exclude Black women from the feminine Bildungsroman narrative that portrays successful heterosexual coupledom as the climax of the coming-of-age plot for white women. So these traditional stereotypes underpin contemporary stereotypes that include the welfare queen, the angry Black woman, the Black bitch, and the Black American princess, which other African American critics have clearly categorized. So today, from what's most relevant is the Black American princess, or independent black woman who becomes the angry black lady. She has her own money and does not need men to take care of her, and is therefore represented as domineering and largely unmarriable. The news media itself perpetuates this stereotype outside of fictional representations by reporting and re-reporting the statistics that of all women, black women are the least likely to be married, that black women are less likely to be married than black men, and that black women are less likely to be a part of the trend in assortative mating, i.e. marrying one's peer in educational status, because black women are much more likely to have a higher education degree than black men. Some of those statistics are debated, much like the 1990s statistic that was thrown around that a single woman in her 30s was more likely to die of a terrorist attack than to get married. As you can imagine, there was some contestation about that, and there is about these as well, but it's the point that they are regularly repeated that is the issue at hand. So in her book, Beyond the Black Lady, Sexuality in the New African American Middle Class, Lisa Thompson discusses the turn of the century trend for feel-good films targeted at the black community. So that is these films here, particularly on the right-hand side, which are exemplified by romantic comedies that provide some of the most visible and enduring images of middle-class blacks. Thompson argues that these films are particularly pernicious in the ways they stereotype black women as contemporary middle-class sapphire. Popular African-American romantic comedies like The Best Man and Soul Food consistently reward women who pursue traditional female roles. They present the desperate social circumstances of professional black women as the result of misplaced priorities and aggressive personalities. In essence, these films uphold and further the cultural stereotype of the black lady as cold, prim, passionless. They also, she argues, in light of bleak marriage rates for black professional women, send an alarmingly conservative message and signal a backlash against the academic and professional successes of these women. So Hamri's films are part of this trend for feel-good films focused on the middle-class blacks, no doubt. And that distinguishes them from the urban black city cinema film that focuses on urban black youths and crime, etc. Moreover, of course, they employ romance film conventions. However, Hamri's films refuse the stereotype of, quote, the black lady as professionally exceptional but personally doomed, allowing their protagonists to achieve both romantic and career success. And that in and of itself is something that makes them unique in the larger context of contemporary romantic comedies. In the pre-Great Recession millennial post-feminist media, the backlash discourse of the vilified career woman, which is of course exemplified by Fatal Attraction, modified, as Diane Negra argues, into kind of retreatist trope. So it's a narrative trope. Both film and television have incorporated fantasies of hometown return, in which a heroine gives up her life in the city to take up again the role of daughter, sister, wife, or sweetheart in a hometown setting. The classic example I always think of is Sweet Home Alabama, which probably nobody's seen, but is Reese Witherspoon, who has this great career in New York. She falls in love with her old boyfriend growing up and moves back to Alabama to have a nice sort of hometown working life rather than a strong going career in New York. However, this return to the home and often downsizing, if not even giving up of work for the post-Southern woman, draws on a long history of the imbrication of domesticity and the idealization of the middle-class white woman evinced by the cult of true womanhood. As Evelyn Brooks Higginbottom has shown on the politics of respectability and early 20th century Baptist church, is this early work, and as Kimberly Springer has articulated for the contemporary representations of the black lady, black women cannot give up work outside the home without risking the respectability, without risking looking like the welfare queen. She says black professional women must adhere to the role of the black lady, a role designed to counter accusations of black female licentiousness, and one that can accommodate the ascension to middle-class status through work outside the home. When there's so few black women filmmakers and so many stereotypes of black women on screen, Lisa Thompson's stance is an important one, and she says, although few opportunities exist for African-American women to direct feature films, filmmakers such as Cheryl Dunye, Darnell Martin, Leslie Harris, and Sana Hamri continue to prioritize compelling, realistic, and nuanced depictions of black women who have sexual agency. Hamri's films in particular situate their prioritization of black women within the mainstream narrative aesthetics of the rom-com, which of course I said earlier is largely associated with white, straight women and the contemporary post-feminist politics of gender. By making the black women the center of this universe, the mainstream tropes of both romantic comedy and post-feminist media culture are complicated and even exposed a bit, even as they in many ways remain intact. So both her films signal their genre early on. I'm going to see if the DVD decided to obey me. I'm going to show you the opening, just the opening of Something New. And because it sort of quintessentially or sort of very easily picks up on the kinds of things that are expected of a rom-com, especially, I think, since the days of Bridget Jones.
Neighborhood. LA, today is one of my favorite days. You want to know why? Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. That's right. One more again, it's Valentine's Day. Yo, check it out. I already got some candy up here. I got a couple listeners send me some flowers. I'm the luckiest dude alive in Los Angeles. Let me say that. Good morning. It's a beautiful day. For one, the sun is up. 65 degrees already outside. 405 is crowded. But who cares? Everybody's in love today. So they're going to get to work when they want to. People want to have flowers. Everybody's getting candy. Every lady already has a date. All the restaurants are booked tonight. When I get off work already, I probably got 4 dates already lined up. I gotta take my mom's out. My girlfriend already sent me a bouquet of flowers. And heaven knows what my wife got planned for me tonight.
Okay, so it begins with fairly typical tropes, the nightmare wedding scenario, waking up, turning it's Valentine's Day, the disconnect between her single life, her working life, her messed up backyard, and what the DJ is saying about it's Valentine's Day, I've got all these dates, everyone's happy, everyone's fine, no bother. So it picks up on all those tropes which are familiar from everything from Bridget Jones to Sex and the City, but puts them in this black middle class context. Later at work that day, her now engaged white colleague and friend bombards Kenya with photos of wedding dresses and then promises to set her up on a blind date, which turns out to be Brian, the white guy, who then she hires to fix that very messy garden for her. At the end of the workday, Kenya has a message on her phone from an ex who is calling her to invite her to his wedding, so her Valentine's Day just gets worse and worse and worse. And the sort of abjectness of singleness, women's singleness, just becomes extreme to that extent, in much the same way, or much similar to the ways that something like Bridget Jones' singleness is made abject. But that night she goes to meet her single friends, sister friends group for a drink that night. They all tell her she's too uptight, which is, I don't have the best image here. This is her friends meeting, but she's got her hair slicked back. She just looks like an accountant. And that she needs to let go in order to find a man. So again, like that abject singleness is set up quickly in the first 10 minutes, and even her own friends are telling her that her problem is her and not anything else. And in Just Right, the first images are of Leslie, Queen Latifah, working as a physical therapist with her patients, but within a minute, her coworker asks her what time her blind date is. That blind date starts off as a dream scenario. They're hitting it off particularly well. They talk about work, future, and kids. They joke about getting toasted on the first date, as in drunk. And then at the end, the guy says he had a very nice evening and he just wants to be friends and gives Leslie a hug. So her singleness is made abject. So she tells her very thin, conventionally thin god sister that Mark told her that she thought made the perfect homegirl. And her easygoing personality, her down-to-earth style, she drives a broken-down Mustang inherited from her grandfather. She's up for getting drunk on a date. She's an unapologetic New Jersey Nets fan and is appalled that her godsister wants to go to the game dressed to the nines because she's going to try to catch a man. So by putting Leslie, played by Queen Latifah, in opposition to Morgan, the film also implies, through their body types in opposition to each other, as well as comments made by Leslie's mother, that Leslie's weight, again, much like Bridget Jones, is part of the reason that she is single. So all of these tropes align Hambury's two romantic comedies with those mainstream films in which white protagonists' point of view is privileged, while presenting their singleness as abject. So the point of view from the date or the wedding is privileged, but they themselves are presented as abject. So that includes My Best Friend's Wedding, Bridget Jones' 27 Dresses, which I was trying to think of. They also, of course, participate in post-feminist media's obsession with consumption. So class plays a largely unspoken, Schreiber argues that class plays a largely unspoken but significant role in the post-feminist romance film, as the wealth and upward mobility of the female characters undergird their personal dilemmas, but also enable a pleasurably commodified backdrop for their love affairs. Leslie comes from a middle-class family and Kenya from an upper-middle-class family, and both films display wealth prominently in their mise-en-scène. Neither of their own mothers appear to work, and each impresses on their daughter the need to dress in an appropriately feminine fashion. Again, much like Bridget Jones's mother, who says, "You're not going to the party dressed like that," and then puts her in something Bridget describes as a carpet. Both protagonists go to fashionable events where they have to put on nice dresses and perform femininity properly. And the settings around the women, around this middle classness, distinguish them from those hood films of the 90s. It also, and as much as it participates in one way alongside those white rom-coms and their obsession with class, which Nancy Meyers gets critiqued for regularly, these films are set apart from Hollywood's insistent habit of ignoring the black middle classes and stereotyping African Americans as unemployed, drug addicts, gangsters, and prostitutes, essentially otherizing and only telling stories, those kinds of stories about black Americans. But even despite their kind of emphasis on new middle classness and upward mobility, these things come into play in a at times, slightly more complex way than mainstream romantic comedies. So as I said, both Leslie's and Kenya's mothers appear to be stay-at-home mothers, and in some ways, that in and of itself contradicts Springer's argument that the black lady must work to have respectability. Neither of those women have any indication that they work. They are black ladies. They're quite uptight. They're kind of constantly telling their daughter what to do, and seems to create a new kind of middle-class version of black ladydom. And within the typical conventions of the romantic comedy, both mothers are made out to be ridiculous to some extent, if not even abject at times. So this is another clip. This is a clip I want to show you from Just Right. And this is just after Leslie's got back from a date. She's talking to her godsister, Morgan, who is planning out her strategy to nab an NBA player. And then the next day, they're going to go to a Nets game together.
So, how was the date? Was it cute?
Yep.
And
he thought I'd make the perfect homegirl.
I'm sorry. But you do have homegirl written all over you.
What? I'm just being my regular self.
You are not supposed to show him your regular self until you've been married for 5 years.
What is all this?
Research. I was reading The Power of Now, and it dawned on me. A girl doesn't just become the wife of an NBA franchise player by accident. It takes strategy, good intel, and vision.
I'm sure that's what Eckhart Tolle thought when he wrote that book.
Say what you want, but don't be hating on your girl when she's a brand.
Morgan, what are you talking about?
These NBA players' wives, I mean, one's got a fragrance, the other has a clothing line coming out. Brands. I'm almost 30. I gotta start thinking about my future, like now.
Ah! You really scare me sometimes. You know, you're crashing in my guest room. Your BMW got repossessed because you stopped making the payments. Does any of this research involve you getting a job?
This is my job. Have you been listening?
I'm going to bed.
Night.
You still rolling to the game with me tomorrow?
Already working on my outfit. Takes good bait to catch fish.
I must be fishing in the wrong river.
Warm, feminine, peachy.
Hey, Mom.
How you gonna get a man dressed like that?
My mom going to the game. And, no. Where's Daddy?
He's in the kitchen working on another one of your projects.
Daddy?
Yeah.
I thought we said we were gonna let a plumber handle those new faucets.
Well, why waste your money on a plumber when your dad's got this under control?
Leslie! Now, this is how you get a man.
I told her to wear a dress.
To a basketball game?
Yeah.
So that kind of interaction also happens in Just Right, where the mother figure is the one who is demanding the proper performance of femininity from her daughter. In Something New, there's a scene in which there's a period when the main character there drops her white boyfriend and dates a black man, the proper black man for a while. He's a lawyer, etc., and brings him home. And he, at one point, it kind of insinuates to Kenya's mother that they're going to get married when he says, who knows what we'll be celebrating in 6 months. And her mother, played by, I have it here, where'd it go? Alfre Woodard, Alfre Woodard there. She becomes quite kind of almost like a Bridget Jones type mother. She's quite silly, she screams, and she plays that abject figure again, telling her daughter that she should be excited, and that's when they break up. Both women get their partners in the end. Both women keep their careers in the end. I've given you the images here of their romantic conclusions, but Leslie gets a job working for the Nets as a trainer, and Kenya gets a raise and gets promoted to partner in her firm. And both of those things happen alongside their marriages to their main partner. So they do not retreat. They reject that retreatism that those films like Sweet Home Alabama suggest was what is the appropriate choices for white women. They actually get it all, to use that horrible phrase, both success in their careers and the men that they want. So I've talked quite a lot, so I'm going to try to actually wrap it up and then and maybe just quickly blow through on my project. So just one thing to say, one thing to take it back to these questions of independent cinema. In response to Jeff King's claim that independent cinema's distinction from mainstream cinema rests largely on the avant-garde or art or quality style, Yanis Zoumakis argues that the eclectic mixture of conventions from all these modes of filmmaking has created a distinct category of generally low-budget film that has been labeled independent, primarily because of its difference from mainstream American cinema, often regardless of how it was financed or produced. So in many ways, these films that I'm looking at are the opposite of that. They have mainstream aesthetics. They don't look like indie films in any of that kind of quirky Wes Anderson kind of way whatsoever, but they are independent films by virtue of their production context and that they remain outside of this studio system. And my main argument actually is that partly the reason that is true is because they are about Black Americans. They are made by Black Americans and they are seen as niche and therefore independent from the mainstream by virtue of that structural racism rather than any kind of sort of cinematic reason that we might be able to theorize in terms of independent aesthetics, mainstream aesthetics, even industrial contexts, et cetera. But except for that, like most women, Black women are not trusted generally with mainstream Hollywood films. So a couple things just to show you could ask me about in the questions and I won't hold your attention any longer. Gina Prince Bythewood's dramas, Love and Basketball and Beyond the Lights, which are both about women, drama romances who fall in love. At the end, both of them have these conclusions where the woman's career comes alongside or ahead of her romantic conclusion. So these are kind of final images. Noni here, who's a singer, who gets her kind of concert at the end, and her man, but at the very last final scene, sees her jumping into the crowd, crowd surfing. And Cassie here, who gets her place on the women's basketball team even though her husband is injured, and he's in the audience with their daughter saying, "Yay, cheering on mommy." And so it's their careers that are foregrounded rather than their romantic conclusions. That's one of the things, this is, because I've held you on for too long, I'll skip through some of the research on Calling the Shots if you're interested in asking me about it. But there are other films that are being made in the UK that also challenge the heteronormative standards of the romantic comedy. I Can't Think Straight, which is about it's Appropriate Behavior is about a Persian American woman and her kind of breakup with her lesbian lover, but also this one's about an Indian Muslim woman and a Jordanian woman who fall in love in Britain. And both of these films, again, were made by women of color and challenged that sort of heteronormative element of the chick flick, but have very conventional moments. This one has all the same kinds of tropes, the wedding nightmares, the kind of jokes about mothers. And one of the things I just wanted to end on, which is why I want to go to this last screen, is all of these films also have those terrible mothers. It's the mothers who can't accept their sexuality. It's the mothers who are worried about their femininity. And it's the fathers who are the ones who give them space to be themselves. In all of Hamry's films, Prince Bythewood's films, and these films, it's that parental distinction between the accepting father and the bad mother who insists on the performance of femininity are all there. And that is something that still remains a question for me of how to think about that and talk about it as it moves across all these very different types of film made in very different types of contexts. So, thank you.